Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Under Budget 2022, Sarawak was allocated 4.6 billion ringgit for development expenditure, while Sabah 5.2 billion. Now, politicians from both sides of the aisle have argued that these allocations do not go far enough in addressing the development imbalance between East and West Malaysia, or even in reflecting the equality between the three territories of the Federation. So how does one assess fairness in terms of budget allocation? Let's speak now to Associate Professor Datuk Madeline Burma, who is a fellow at the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. Madeline, when we talk about like a quote unquote fairness in allocation to the states and territories of the Federation when it comes to budgets, how do you think we should best assess those budget considerations? I mean, is it looking at, say, the development gap, or is it looking at population size and geographical mass of a state or a territory? Or do you think it should be how much contribution a state or territory makes to national GDP or to the federal coffers? How do you think about what is fair allocation?
Wow, Melissa, that was a very challenging question, especially the last part. In terms when you mentioned about the contribution of the state, I think that has always been the point of contention from both states. Okay, let me just say thank you to both of you for inviting me to share my thoughts. Melissa, you mentioned that Sarawak received about 4.6 billion in terms of budget allocation in budget 2022, right? Okay, if you look at the way budgets are being allocated in our country, we have what we call the federal list, and let's look at the kind of what we call financial, or rather how we allocate our finances in this country, and how do we collect taxes, secondly, and how do we spend them. Now, in the context of our country, this is very much a federal-state relationship in the context of a federation. Number one, if we look at the size of the budget, we must not forget that we are part of a federation of many, many states. That's number one, okay? So number two, the way the budget are being allocated is based on, it's very federal-centric. Federal-centric means a lot of it, if you look at the way budgets are being allocated, it's been determined in the federal capital. It's Putrajaya. It is Putrajaya-centric. And this is one of the things that made a lot of Sabahan, Sarawak, maybe even Kelantan, Terengganu, and all the other 6 states felt that it is kind of unfair. Another thing that we need to know about the way budgets are being allocated is also that you did mention, size of the population size and the GDP. So the sad thing about Sarawak is that Sarawak is one of the biggest states in terms of size, the geographical, if you look at the size, but and very big in terms of its contribution because of oil and gas. However, in terms of population, Sarawak has one of the smallest. So in that sense, there is a bit of a mismatching in terms of budget allocation. So the state needs a lot in terms of development expenditure. But in terms of its allocation, in the name of federal-state relationship, in the name of unity, we find that budgets are being allocated in such a way that so that there will be equity, the concept of equitable distribution, so that no one state will receive much more as compared to the others. So in that sense, Melissa, I do feel that there is a need to do what we call financial decentralization, to give more powers to the state, number one. Number two is that to take into account the level of development of the state. For example, Sabah, Sarawak, and that was mentioned recently in our budget 2022 that about 5 states will be given special allocation. But these 5 states have been have been, in a way, if you look at the terms of development, Sabah, Sarawak, and Kelantan, for example. Sabah is the poorest state in the whole of Malaysia, followed by Kelantan, and the third state is Sarawak. So I do think that we do need to take into account the level of development, the rate of poverty, and the size of the population, and of course, the geographical size of the state. Yeah, Melissa, that's it.
So Madeline, so in your assessment, if you use those metrics, do you think Sabah and Sarawak have gotten a fair deal in this budget?
Okay, put it this way. Not only this budget, we have not had a fair deal. It has been for a long time, Shad. So I'm putting it here because I do think that Sabah and Sarawak, or even the other three states, even Kelantan and Terengganu, I think these are states that have been, if you look at the level of development, they are a bit backward. So I do think that they deserve to have more, not the 5.4 billion or the 5.2 billion for Sabah and 4.6 billion in terms of budget allocation.
Right. The budget allocation for looking at Sabah and Sarawak specifically, I think there was an increase if you compare that from the previous budget to this year's budget. I think there was an increase of 100 million each, if I'm not mistaken. Madeline, when you look at some of the initiatives and the allocations under allocations for Sabah and Sarawak from previous budgets, they seem to be somewhat similar. And I'm just wondering, since you've been watching and tracking the development and the impact on poverty and the impact on the ground, have these allocations kind of moved the needle in terms of development and welfare in the state?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that there has been an increase in terms of budget allocation. That's in terms of percentage, right? That we do. I mean, I recognize the fact that there has been an increase. However, the needs of Sabah and Sarawak, it is not about equality, Melissa. When we talk about allocation, it is not about equality. It is about equity based on the needs of the state. So Sabah, Sarawak, we cannot equate it in terms of the kind of level of development. I mean, I've just came back from Sarawak. And you look at it in terms of the size of the state, we're talking about, infrastructure development, we're talking about dilapidated school, and we're talking about lost learning generation. If we talk about lost learning generation alone, in Sarawak and Sabah, in our rural areas, I mean, I always say, Wi-Fi either, buaya ada, Wi-Fi tiada. These are the kind of development that Sabah and Sarawak needs. I think we need more than twice or even 3 times the kind of budget that has been allocated to other states, or in terms of the size. So to enable us to narrow the development gap between these two states and other states in Peninsular Malaysia. Because Sarawak, if you notice,
Madeline, can I interrupt you? Yeah, yes. Madeline, you raised the question of decentralization just now, and I know there is some debate as to who handles these allocations. Is this money going directly to the state government or the territories of Sabah and Sarawak, or are they going to federal agencies? Who's in control of this money? Who's setting the priorities?
Okay, thank you very much, Ed. Okay, basically, as a federation, it is very much a centralized issue. Okay, and that's why there have a lot of efforts have been made to decentralize finance in terms of financing for the state. Now, for example, I'll let you know that I'm not saying that the states are not receiving any kind of grants or loans. Okay, for example, we have what we call the federal lease, and we do have for the state lease. The federal will get the major chunk of the kind of taxes. If you look at the kind of taxes that will be imposed by the federal, for example, even like petroleum. The state only has a very small percentage. They're taxed on Petronas, they're taxed on petroleum, they even tax on the petroleum, on the companies involved. So these are the kind of issues that is very much it's very centralized. So the states do receive allocations. Like for Sabah and Sarawak, we do have what we call tax sharing grant. We do have that, meaning to say a certain percentage, about 10%, will be allocated to the states that, where they receive a grant based on the amount that has been contributed in terms of tin or mining, and in the case of Sabah and Sarawak, for example, we have oil and gas. So we do receive an extra 10%. That's number one. The other one is what we call the general purpose grant. So this grant is based on population size, the size of and also GDP, and also a special allocation for Sabah and Sarawak. Yes, we do receive that. And the third one, we also, if you look at Sabah and Sarawak, they do receive what we call specific grants by virtue of the fact that with the formation of Malaysia, they do have special grants. However, despite of all these grants that are being allocated, the nature of tax collection and the way expenditures, are being allocated to the state, it is still very much centralized. So it is a very centralized way of managing our budget in the context of a federal-state relationship. So to me, what is important is that there needs to be decentralization, and there are efforts going towards that. Yeah.
Can I ask you what is lost?
Yes.
In centralizing the, can I ask you what is lost when budget allocations are centralized? What do the people of Sarawak lose when federal budgets are so centralized in that way?
First, we do not have control about how, number one, taxes. If you look at our taxes, there are some taxes that what we call the federal lease. The state only receives the minor ones, like they are related to land issues or indirect taxes. But the major chunk of the taxes will be collected by the federal, and from there it will be distributed to the respective states.
Sorry, if I may refine my question, does that mean that federal is not aware of how best to spend this allocation for the people of Sarawak?
I'm sure they know how best it is to be spent, but because in the name of federation, they said, okay, we need to make sure that all the states have equal share, so that to ensure that their development is kind of been managed properly. But if you look at Sabah and Sarawak, the level of development in both states have been very left behind. So, in my opinion, the way the budget has been allocated has not been successful in addressing this inequality in terms of development.
Okay, so Madeline, so we have a situation now where Sabah and Sarawak's contribution to the Federal Assembly, to Parliament, is crucial for any government to be formed. No longer are they taken for granted as a vote bank for, as it were, in the Barisan Nasional days. Have they leveraged that clout in shaping the budget? And how so? Could you explain?
Yeah, in a way, yes. Now, first, the way the budget is being, like for the grants and everything, the federal lease, and we have the federal lease, the state lease, these are in the Constitution. It's in the federal Constitution. So there is a legal binding to the what can the state raise in terms of their taxes and what can the state spend. That's the most. But there are other aspects that both Sabah and Sarawak are really negotiating, and I think they're really negotiating hard, is on the MA 63. If you heard about the 20 points and 18 points. And I think under the present government and even the previous government, even under PH, there were already efforts made towards, giving more leeway to both Sabah and Sarawak to enable them to have a better, control of their resources. So I think these are things as part of our effort, or rather the federal government's effort to kind of to ensure that Sabah and Sarawak, to narrow the gap in terms of, in the word they used was kemakmuran bersama, in the name of shared prosperity. Because we cannot have this kind of budget allocation, we cannot have a kind of development where, if you talk about keluarga Malaysia, the Malaysian family, some of the children are rich, some of the children are poor, some of the children, for example, Sabah and Sarawak, they are the major contributors in terms of, in terms of the federal budget. But yet, in terms of the kind of allocation that was allocated to them, really, I think there needs to be increased. That's basically the way I look at it. Yeah.
Madeline, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us tonight. Brilliant perspectives as always. Madeline Burma, Dr. Madeline Burma from the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. There, we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned.
Ayuh keluarga Malaysia, kita bulatkan tekad dan bersatu hati untuk terus memelihara serta mempertahankan kedaulatan negara. Sebagai keluarga Malaysia yang besar, kita kita harus bertoleransi dalam semua perkara. Hormat menghormati serta mengekalkan perpaduan rakyat yang berbilang kaum, agama dan bangsa serta integrasi nasional silang budaya adalah tunjang kekuatan kita sebagai sebuah negara bangsa yang berjaya. Umpama selembar benang dikait, ditenun dan dijalin, akhirnya menjadi kain yang sempurna indah.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti
Hello, thank you so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation. Assessing Budget 2022, was it fair in its allocation to the territories of Sabah and Sarawak? Joining us now is economist Rafiq Idris. He's a senior lecturer with the Faculty of Business, Economics and Accountancy at University Malaysia, Sabah. He's also the director of UMS's Centre for Investment, Endowment and Wakaf. Rafiq, this was the biggest budget ever tabled by the federal government. But looking at the specifically at the allocation for the Borneo states, I mean, what in looking through the lens of that, specifically for Sabah, did this budget adequately address those development needs of the territories of Sabah and Sarawak?
Okay, thank you, Melissa, for the question. Okay, annual budget and the actual spending in the following year is an exercise of fiscal policy. Fairness to me is to put things at the right place. To me, spending should be based on needs, considering the amount of revenue the state is contributing to the federal government. Okay, and we also must consider the level of development as well as the geographical features of that state. Okay, since the formation of Malaysian Federation in 1963, many things have been achieved. Many things have been improved. Infrastructure development has been ameliorated significantly. Export products have been more diversified. Many economic opportunities have been created. But despite all this, some have argued that Sabah should have gotten even more. Okay, we should have been given greater attention. Some express that Sabah is still backward as compared to many other states in Malaysia. Sabah's per capita income in 2020 was reported to be about 22,000 over ringgit Malaysia. And that is the second lowest in the country. And we need to increase more than 100% to achieve the level of high income state. Poverty incidence in Sabah is still the highest or among the highest. I would also like to share some numbers. Okay, in 1984, just to show one example, the household gross income of Sabah and Wilayah Persekutuan Labuan were higher than Sarawak, higher than Melaka, higher than Perlis, higher than Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, and Perak. the situation is no longer the same. What went wrong? Some view that Sabah's economic performance is underperforming due to inadequate allocation from the government, a lack of autonomy in decision-making, and infrastructure, among others. There are still many issues that require serious attention, if I were to mention here. So in 2022 budget announcement by Yang Amat Berhormat Finance Minister, it was clear that a sum of 75.6 billion was allocated for that development spending, and Sabah obtained 5.2 billion only, and that is just about 6.8% out of the overall budget. I want to highlight here certain districts in Sabah. Okay, for example, the district of Tongot is bigger than few states in Peninsular Malaysia. Okay, so the point that I would like to emphasize here is that fairness is to put things at the right place. To me, spending should be based on the needs, considering the amount of revenue the state is contributing, considering the level of development and the geographical features of the state. We have Wawasan Kemakmuran Bersama 2030, okay, to become
Rafiq,
a high-income nation.
Sorry. Right. Right. So, Rafiq, can I interrupt you for a second? Thank you so much for laying that out for us. I want to ask you, just to give the audience a sense of what you're looking at. So 5.2 billion, let's say you were the Prime Minister of Malaysia. What would be a fair number? For Sabah, what would be a fair number? If we could give Sabah without taking away from anyone else, what would you give Sabah?
Okay, to name a figure, it's not easy. But what people is expecting a significant improvement. We always receive about 4 to 5 billion only. Why don't we get 10 billion this time around, for example? Okay, and people is hoping there is a significant change based on the spirit of Keluarga Malaysia being announced by the government.
Okay. Well, I like that you pointed out that it was 6.8% of the overall budget. And, you know, putting that into context, sometimes when you hear the headline figure, it sounds like a lot. But when you put it into context, particularly some of the challenges or disadvantages that Sabah has had in the past few years in terms of development, I do think that that figure is quite a small allocation in terms of the overall budget. I do want to ask you, when you look at the budget specifically in some of the allocations that were earmarked for Sabah, do you feel, did those allocations hit the right marks? I mean, in terms of what needs to be addressed most pressingly in Sabah, did it hit the mark?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it hit some of the strategic areas on which we expect. For example, things related to infrastructure. On that, I would look at it positively. That means the government is very concerned with the current development and the infrastructure gap that we are facing in Sabah.
Rafiq, what do you think in terms of the governance structures? We talked earlier to Madeline Burma. She was talking about decentralizing, the management, and so do you think that that Sabah has a strong governance structure, so that, and because this would not be unique to any other territories of Malaysia, but in terms of limiting leakages, corruption, inefficiencies that we see across the federation, how does Sabah rate in terms of good governance?
All right. Okay. To me, this issue does not really arise. Okay. Sabah contributed a lot. Our petroleum export is more than 20 billion. Okay, Sabahans, I think, are wiser and practical in their decision. They are more aligned with federal state aspiration in making their political decision, as shown in latest state election in 2020. So this aspiration, I would say itself, is a benchmark of an excellent state governance. Within, in the past 20 years, for example, within these 3 years of Malaysian political whirlpool, Sabahans have learned a lot. Therefore, the past misadventure has indeed created a practical platform for a more prudent governance affairs, I would say.
Sorry, could you elaborate on that? What do you mean by tactical prudence? Could you just elaborate on what you mean by that?
Sorry, come again?
Sorry, could you just elaborate on what you mean by the last bit about Sabahans have learnt from their experience and require more tactical prudence? What do you mean by that?
Okay, in the past 20, 30, 40 years, for example, okay, we have experienced an up and downs in our economic performance and our relations with the federal government. And based on my study, for example, I can see a clear trend that if we do not have a good, I would say good relations with the federal government, for example, it will have an effect on the economy. So I think we have learned from our experience, and therefore we are looking forward with a good relation with the federal government. We can progress even much better in the future.
Yeah, right. So Rafiq, I understand what you're saying, because when states or territories have been in opposition to the federal government, they have often lost out. Kelantan, decades of underdevelopment because it was in opposition, and then several administrations in Sabah, of course, also in opposition to the federal at some point in time. Could you help us understand the relative clout now that Sabah has? Not just because it is, aligned to the current federal government, but because of its importance in making up numbers, considering the political volatility in the peninsula. Do you think Sabahan politicians and leaders have leveraged sufficiently their clout, their new clout, in pressing for more allocations and better planning of their needs?
All right. Okay, I agree. It is indeed an important aspect of political bargaining. Okay, with the continuous requests or demands made by leaders from Sabah, the wishes and demands of Sabahans would at least be heard at the federal level. And as such, the federal government needs to be responsive to the wishes. So the question is whether or not those requests or demands are fulfilled. And again, it also highly dependent on how skillful or how serious the Sabahan leaders are in pushing or persuading the federal government to respond to their requests and demands.
Okay. All right. Rafiq, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate your time. Rafiq Idris there from University Malaysia, Sabah. And he wraps up this episode of Consider This. Before we leave you tonight, a reminder that you can get all the latest information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com, as well as the Astro Awani app. I'm Melissa Idris, and thank you so much for watching the show.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
See you on Monday. Have a great weekend, folks. Good night.
Good night.